Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Arthur Sinodinos here, Australian Ambassador to the US. Just introducing a wonderful G'day USA dialogue on critical minerals. I say it's wonderful because we've got a very good panel. I'll let Todd Malin do the introductions, but Todd Malin, VP Corporate Relations at Rio Tinto, will be doing the introduction. But from my point of view, it's great to see Anne Bray from the embassy on this call. She'll be on this video. She'll be holding up our end of things. Frank Fannon, great to see Frank again. We did good work with Frank in the previous administration, and it's good to see he's surviving and thriving. And Anna Fendley, I haven't met, but welcome, Anna. It's great to have a union perspective. And Tariq Shah, Chief of Staff at the US Department of Energy. So we've got a decision maker. And this is an area where we need to get moving, get decisions made. Australia welcomes the supply chain review that's just been released by the administration here to do with critical minerals. But it demonstrates there's a lot to do. Our submission to the review made it clear that we think we've got to work in a complementary way with a partnership and look at end-to-end, how we create markets for these critical minerals. And the reason these minerals are critical is because they're important for electric vehicles. They're important in batteries and magnets, for renewable energy systems. They're important for sensitive defense production. So these are critical minerals that need to be available with trusted partners, because at the moment, many of them are in markets dominated by one or two players, not necessarily with fully beneficial intent. And that is a challenge, particularly in this geostrategic environment that we're in now. We cannot afford to have these sensitive minerals dominated by countries that may be seeking to use them to monopolize or potentially create opportunities for themselves, not just industrially, but in national security terms. So today is an opportunity to think about how we do that. My own view is that both in Australia and the US, it does require us to think imaginatively about end-to-end and how we try and use, whether it's offtake arrangements, equity financing, or other mechanisms, stockpiling mechanisms to help finance these things, to get people developing and supplying these products. Now, there are a lot of good projects around. There are a lot of good projects here in the US, a lot of good projects in Australia. So we've got plenty to work with. But the real challenge is to think in terms of our mindset, it's a shift towards perhaps what I might describe as more of an industry policy mindset. But I think it's a very important mindset. So today, I'm not going to steal the thunder of the others. I've got some strong views on this, but you've got a panel that is really going to take you through all of this. I'm going to work hard with my colleagues in the US, with the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office in Australia, to get projects going. We're seeing some good projects here. Linus is doing good work with the Department of Defense. But let's see how we can create end-to-end use using some of the mechanisms I mentioned before. So with that, Todd, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ambassador. Really appreciate it, and really excited to be leading this panel today. I'd like to also compliment John Barry and the team at the AAA on putting together another great program focused on critical minerals and having the impeccable timing of scheduling this 2 days after the Biden administration put out their report on critical supply chains that has a huge focus on critical minerals and especially the electric vehicle supply chain. So without further ado, I'll do quick introductions, and then we're going to go through a series of questions and have some discussion amongst the panel. We've only got an hour, so we'll get right to it. First off, I'd like to introduce Anne Bray. Anne is Minister-Counsellor for the Australian Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, and focused on the US and Canada out of the embassy here in Washington. Next, Frank Fannin is Managing Director of Fannin Global Advisors, a strategic advisory focused on geopolitics, energy transition, and market transformation. Frank was the first Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources at the State Department in the Trump administration. And Frank is a veteran of U.S.-Australia resources discussions, having led BHP's government affairs team in the region prior to going to the State Department. Anna Fendley is the United Steelworkers Director of Regulatory and State Policy and leads the steelworkers in the Blue-Green Alliance and the Carbon Capture Coalition. Anna is somebody who's I've had many conversations with about critical minerals policy, and I'm really excited to get her input and the input of the union workforce. And finally, Tarak Shah. Tarak is Chief of Staff of the Department of Energy and for Secretary Jennifer Granholm. Tarak has spent much of his career focusing on combating climate change. He led the climate and science team in the Biden-Harris transition team. And this is not his first turn at the Department of Energy. He was Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of Science and Energy in the Obama administration. So we've got a great panel and lots to talk about on progress between Australia and the US to address supply chain security issues. And to really focus, I think, also hopefully on the amazing amount of innovation that's going on in Australia and in the US, not only to look at where do we find the resources that we need to meet this challenge, but also what is the technology solution? What are the technology solutions that we can find to make sure that we process the resources that we have? And that's not only resources of natural resources that are coming out of the ground, but also making sure we're focusing on recycling and that we're actually looking at ways to leverage the material that's already in the supply chain. And are we going to be able to have ways to reuse that? And I think that the report that came out yesterday or 2 days ago from the Biden administration has a really nice focus on not only primary materials, virgin materials, but also looking at recycling strategies, which I think is really, really important. Okay, so let's do the first question. I mean, it's been a little more than a year since AAA last had a session focused on critical minerals, collaboration between the US and Australia to resolve supply chain security issues, and ways to work together to address critical mineral resources and address these supply chain issues. In that time period, panel, what do you think are things that have changed for the good or for the worse over the last 18 months since we last got together? I think some of you, at least listened to the last panel. What are your observations on material developments in the US, Australia, or just in the bilateral relationship that stand out to you as markers of success or things that are actually not working out that well? Anne, do you mind kicking off for us?
Sure, thanks, Todd. Look, I think a big positive is the focus on secure supply chains and the recognition we need to work together on them. On the US side, we've seen the US supply chain review this week coming out as an example. And on the Australian side, we've set up an Office of Supply Chain Resilience, and we've just launched a $1.3 billion modern manufacturing initiative, and that aims to build domestic manufacturing in key sectors such as critical minerals processing and energy. I think on the critical minerals side, the pendulum's really swung quite hard in demand, particularly for rare earths and minerals needed for defence and clean energy, including sort of magnets, electric vehicles, and stationary batteries. If we look at Australia alone, in our electricity grid, we've got about 270 megawatts of battery capacity there, and we've got 300 megawatts committed, but we've got about 19,000 megawatts capacity announced. So that's a huge demand. And these minerals were seeing quite low prices only sort of 12 months ago, but now we can see that lithium supplies may not be able to keep up with demand. I think another good thing is the increased focus on environmental and social governance. And as you know, Australia's got some of the highest ESG standards in the world. We're members of ERGI, and the Australian Minerals Council has adopted the Canadian towards sustainable mineral standards. And we're also investing in some mineral ethical certification. So, and we're funding a blockchain mineral provenance and traceability platform. If I think about the negative side, I think we've seen further concentration of some supply chains, and monopoly players are effectively able to set the price and prevent competition from entering the market. So we need to address that. And I'm really hoping with the increasing focus on ESG that sort of translates into sort of purchasing decisions rather than the lowest cost winning most of the time. So I might leave it there, let the other panel members.
Yeah, that's a really good point about, procurement policies not just being focused on price and quality anymore. And we can come back to that. Frank, do you want to kick off next?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with all of you as well. I guess 18 months, that was your time horizon. Wow, that was a different planet Earth 18 months ago, really. And I guess I would look at, in that context, I would look at what's changed, the 3 C's, being climate, China, and COVID. And I think the world has really gone through this crucible, one on the positive side with respect to climate, and Nan spoke eloquently to this, is greater awareness and the action, the calls to action to do something, and how do countries come together to address that global challenge. COVID has underscored, in a way, it really accelerated the vulnerabilities that countries see in their own supply chains. EY just did a report recently and concluded that that some 90% of companies were harmed by the COVID supply chain crunch. So the ongoing semiconductor issue is an example of that. And they also are putting supply chain transparency as one of the key issues going forward in the next 3 years. And then China, in both respects, China is the greatest challenge we face, both in terms of control of in the context of clean energy supply chains, very dominant position in control, and also has seen their ability to use that supply chain to advance their own political agenda in various iterations. And I think the ongoing hostility to Australia in particular is extremely troubling. We have seen some continuity of efforts in terms of our bilateral relationship and the elevation of this being important for us to kind of get a grips on to achieve our shared ambitions to address climate change and moving forward with cleaner energy. And I think the 100-day report and the other reports are evidence of that, and really strike at the heart of how important these diplomatic engagements are, and to build something around shared values, which I think was spoken to earlier. So I really think we've kind of gone through a dark period, but we see kind of the light now, and when we're all marching toward it in lockstep. Thanks, Todd.
No, that's great. That's great. Tarak, you were not in government 18 months ago, but now you've got your hand on the decision-making capabilities of this administration, and maybe you'd like to just share a few words of observation about how you look at what U.S. and Australia are capable of doing.
Yes. Well, 18 months ago, I was sitting on a couch watching Star Trek reruns, and that was pretty enjoyable. But a lot has changed in the last 18 months. Frank and mentioned some of them, but as Frank said, the pandemic has laid bare the challenges with our supply chains, toilet paper 14 months ago to vaccines globally right now. And I just think that the time is right for us to think through all sorts of supply chain challenges, including critical minerals. And that's what you've seen the administration really come strongly out of the gate, focusing on. I also think that President Biden's election has meant that there has been an emphatic end to the acceptance of climate denialism here in the United States. And frankly, we should give no quarter to it among our allies or competitors. Other changes mean that there's been a huge realization about the economic opportunity associated with the clean energy future. There's this sort of clear view by countries and companies around the world that this is a race to win the future. In fact, my boss, Secretary of Energy, Secretary Jennifer Granholm, is in Nevada at this very moment, which is a leading state for US minerals, talking about the economic opportunities associated with clean energy. And I also think there's an evolving picture that we can do this right with high road labor standards and environmental standards, or we can continue to bow at the altar of lowest costs, which means abusing workers, human rights abuses, and abusing our planet for short-term gain. But, as I started by saying, I think President Biden has made it clear that we have got to have a national strategy on industrial competitiveness, and he's proposed a plan, the American Jobs Plan, to help us get there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Anna, thoughts from the labor community?
Sure. I feel like a lot of what we've been thinking about has been said here. Of course, 18 months ago was very different. I really liked Frank's framing of the 3 C's. Certainly China, climate, and COVID have really changed the world in the last 18 months. And Tarak laid out some of these real world examples about the importance of supply chains, and I'll just note our union is the pulp and paper union in the US too. So our members making toilet paper were working overtime for a while, 14 months or so ago. But I think that really underscores for me one of the more tangible things that has changed, both that COVID has shown us and with President Biden's election, is that there is so much more understanding and acknowledgement among everyday Americans anyway about the importance of supply chains, and that the things that we use every day don't just appear out of thin air. They have to be made. And so I think that this is a really wonderful time to be having this conversation, because this is about the future, and I think there is real political appetite in both countries to really have this discussion and plan and figure out how we're going to move forward individually and as allies.
Great. No, that's great. Well, maybe we turn to the 100-day plan that came out 2 days ago. I assume everybody's been through it, probably Tarak one too many times. But before we invite you to brag on it, I just asked the panel to make a few observations about the highlights that stuck out to you. I think it's, to be fair, I think in critical mineral policy, as long as I've been following this area, really for me, it goes back to actually the Obama administration, and actually a very consistent thread of focus around critical minerals between the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. And there's almost sort of a stair step in building along the line of a realization, as Anna said, that these materials don't grow on trees. We have got to have a all of the above strategy that involves domestic mineral development, recycling, working with allies, using innovation to find new approaches. And so I really see a lot of different ingredients in the report, but I thought it was excellent from my standpoint. Frank, do you want to kick us off on just sort of the key observations or things that really have jumped out at you? I mean, obviously it's a lot to digest, but there's a lot of good content there. But there are a couple of things that I think probably jumped out.
Yeah, no, it was a good piece of work, and it's kind of funny because we talk about the report, and then there's like the report, and then the report's children, all of these other reports, and so, but if I could focus in on the main, the big one, I guess. The stuff that and look, it's kind of a hammer and nail. I was a longtime diplomat, and so I was focused on the international context of some of this stuff. But I was really struck by and really was encouraged to see a strong emphasis on transparency and improving of governance standards. That's absolutely critical. And I would argue it is free nations' superpower. The issue that we see in the context, and I spoke to it in the report as well, recognizing some of the challenges with the way China does things, both on an environmental standpoint and as well as a labor standpoint. As we move forward with transparency and reporting, I have a full expectation that these other elements, the S and the G of the ESG, should be integrated into our thinking in the same way that greenhouse gases are increasingly integrated. And if we do that, then it will say what's permissible and not. And I think that's absolutely critical to do that. I've been all around the world. Countries want US, Australian kind of investment. There are reputational clouds over these countries and projects, and we need to dispel that, and so that we can develop these resources in a responsible way that advances the ambition and economic development of countries and allows the world to get the minerals it needs to move forward with defense and the energy transition. So I was really struck by some of that. I was also struck by our other comparative advantage, our other secret weapon in the West is our private sector. And we cannot outcompete China in terms of being more China-like. We have to mobilize the private sector. And again, I think that's part and parcel of the integration of the transparency component and moving forward, alignment of diplomatic arrangements. And the ambassador spoke to Linus. That's a heck of an interesting story. You've got an Australian company with US assets that's backed by the Japanese, all here to develop something. It's an allied picture. So there's a lot to cover in the report. There's a lot of content, but let me pause there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank. Anna, how about for you? What jumped out at you?
Yeah, there were a few things, and we were very excited that the reports came out. Very excited about the initial executive order. Have been eagerly awaiting these. I think we appreciated that that the reports outlined that this problem that our union has been identifying for a long time, which is that some of our insufficient manufacturing capacity has caused some of this insecurity in our supply chains. And our union, we cut, our short name is Steelworkers, right? But we cut across manufacturing in the United States, and we do see plant closures and job loss, and so I think it's good that the reports focus that as one of the key problems to be solved with recommendations. Specific to critical minerals, we really love that it's talking about creating 21st century standards, doing this in the right way. And I think that's really the critical opportunity for the US and Australia. Our union's been thinking a lot about what responsible mining is in this day and age. Todd, we've been talking quite a bit about this, and what are the models we should look to. We're also really thinking about what comes after that actual extraction. And I think the reports really start to speak to that. How do we locate processing in places where we're not, relying on China? Taking out of the equation that it's China, extracting something here in the US and shipping it across the Pacific and then shipping it back is crazy. So I think we were excited about those things, but the thing that I want to kind of end my response with that we were most excited about was this piece that was in the introduction in the section about a new approach. And I'll just read the first sentence of the paragraph. American workers must be the foundation for resilience, of our supply chains, and talks about how our history of focusing on labor as a cost to be controlled rather than an asset to be invested in is a foundational problem. And so we're very excited about working with the Biden administration to make sure that we're building careers, we're building communities, we're building We're really building our economy around new technologies and around really stable supply chains for the long-term economic security. So I'll stop there, but I just think it's so exciting.
Yeah, I really like that point. Obviously the steel workers represent many of Rio Tinto's employees in Utah and Arizona, and other unions represent our operations in California. And I think the other thing is bringing the employee base in on some of these challenges where there's, we need innovation in new approaches to extraction of these materials. And so in some of our new operations and new innovations, it's been the workers that have come up with the people that are on the front lines and the smelters and the mines are the ones that are sourcing some of the best innovations. So I take the point about that. And thoughts from you in terms of what really jumped out in the 100-day report.
Yeah, look, Todd, a couple of specifics. I think one of the highlights is the mention of the US defense stockpile. And whilst US defense demand itself is relatively low as a percentage of, total demand for rare earths, I think it still could help create a floor price and provide some offtake agreements. And that provides, there's a couple of positives out of that. By creating that certainty of price, which prevents monopoly actors trying to destroy competitors, it creates a certainty of supply for US demand, which reduces the risk if monopoly actors choose to constrain supply for whatever reason. And it's also could help create demand certainty and potentially assist some of the, construction-ready projects that are out there to get financing. I think also the decision to look at Section 232 for neodymium magnets is also worth noting. 90% of the world's neodymium magnets are made in China, and that concentration has grown from 80% 10 years ago. And those magnets are very important for electric vehicles, for wind turbines and other applications, including defense. And so that really aligns with our focus. So we need to move downstream to capture more of the value from the products we mine, and the US is looking to move upstream. Probably a really good example of the complementarity of our goals can be found in lithium. So an American company, Albemarle, is extracting lithium from one of the largest lithium mines in the world in WA. But they're also advancing construction of one of the world's largest lithium hydroxide facility nearby. And by producing lithium hydroxide in Australia, we're reducing the amount of lithium spodumene that gets shipped to a third country, and which then exports those, and they can be exported straight to the cathode producers if need be, or even Australia developing those cathodes themselves. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I want to return to that and point to the comments of the chairman of Tesla, who gave a speech in Australia last week, and she made exactly that point. And I think that's really worth coming back to. But Tarak, why don't you share sort of the author's views on what the highlights are, what people should really read into the report as the key priorities.
Great. And Anne, we will happily manufacture those cathodes here in the US. So I will continue our partnership going. I want to set the stage a little bit because, well, it is a very well-written report. If I do say so myself, I don't expect all of the listeners and watchers to have read it. So let me just say a little bit about what's in it. Heading back to February, the president ordered 4 of our agencies in the US government, the Department of Energy included, to do these 100-day evaluations of supply chain vulnerabilities in 4 key areas. And they were pharmaceutical ingredients, semiconductors, large batteries, and critical minerals. And, I think stepping back, the findings of the reports, because it's really 4 reports in one, aren't pretty. In short, these weaknesses in our supply chain threaten our economic, security, and technological leadership as a country. And so the report goes through and analyzes these weaknesses and devises specific strategies to respond. And, at the highest level, this starts with not just sitting back as other countries take a coordinated approach to their supply chains, but getting in the game by developing end-to-end industrial strategies for key US supply chains, critical minerals and critical materials included, and working with our private sector, as Frank mentioned, and our allies and partners, as all of you have mentioned, to fulfill these needs. For batteries, which is the supply chain evaluation that DOE was responsible for, our key finding is that we've just got to pull on every lever that we can, both on the demand and supply side. And on the demand side, the report identifies that we've just got to juice demand. And so the report recommends that Congress, our US Congress, incentivize electric vehicles, everything from tax credits for passenger vehicles to direct funding for school and transit buses. And on the supply side, we've identified levers to pull along the whole supply chain, starting with critical minerals extraction, to refining and processing, to cell and pack manufacturing, all the way to end-of-life recycling. And these include a whole suite of R&D proposals, tax and capital support, trade policies. And some of that we can do through executive action, which we are doing, and some of it, a lot of it, requires our Congress to act. But let me just briefly identify the executive actions we're taking right away. In the battery space, we're clarifying here at the Department of Energy that our Loan Programs Office has up to $17 billion available immediately to support cell and pack manufacturing, not just final EV manufacturing. And we're also going to help agencies of the federal government lead by example by procuring energy storage for our federal facilities. This goes to what Ann was talking about using federal demand. We've also released a national blueprint for lithium batteries that has a 10-year whole of government strategy spelled out in depth. We're going to talk a lot more about that this coming Monday in a roundtable, public roundtable that DOE is convening with manufacturers throughout the battery supply chain. I encourage anyone who wants to join that. And for critical minerals, which is another, second part of the report that the Defense Department led on, but of course we worked with them on. We've now stood up a working group to identify sites where critical minerals could be produced and processed in the United States while adhering to the highest environmental, labor, and sustainability standards. We're also standing up a working group to modernize mine permitting, and it's starting on a new effort to better map resources in the United States. Our Defense Department is going to use its Defense Production Act to scale up grants, loans, offtake agreements for critical minerals. And we're going to expand US support for international efforts to build critical mineral supply chains. And finally, we're going to stand up a trade strike force that really goes after unfair foreign trade practices that have eroded critical supply chains and identify opportunities in that strike force to strengthen approaches to supply chain resilience with our partners and allies. Let me just say one final word on extraction, because there was some misinformation in the press before the report came out, which is that this administration recognizes that we've got to pursue every strategy. And of course, we're going to keep working with our partners and allies, Australia included, to responsibly source critical minerals from across the globe. But we are also going to pursue domestic opportunities because we have a supply here at home.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that. And I think, from the mining and metals industry in the United States and in Australia, it was great to see, the statement that clarified from the White House about this all of above strategy. But then in the actual report, and you mentioned it just now, a clear recognition that sometimes the permitting process, even though we want to maintain these high standards, the permitting process can take 7-10 years, and that amount of time doesn't correlate to the high standards. And so I think it was great that there was a frank recognition of that. I thought the other thing that really jumped out at me was a recognition of the importance of processing. And Anne touched on this in her anecdote about lithium in Australia. And processing innovation and what the Critical Materials Institute and the 7 national labs are doing with the private sector, I think is a great example of what we should be doing more of and putting more resources into that. Rio's been a member of CMI for probably 10 years now. And in a number of projects, we've been able to leverage the expertise and the knowledge of the experts within CMI to help us advance innovations in processing that then in turn help us to extract more out of the operations we already have. You know, for instance, we just announced a tellurium plant at our mine in Utah that will be able to extract tellurium, which is on the critical mineral list. CMI experts helped us with that, but nobody's going to go out and build a tellurium mine. You got to get it as a byproduct of what is already coming out in other processes. And it's that sort of thinking, that sort of full value mining approach that I think is quite important for us to leverage in what the administration has put on the table. And it's incumbent on the industry to also step up to that challenge in critical mineral supply chains. So great. Anne, can you outline just maybe a few of the highlights of what's happening in Australia and the focus of the government? CSIRO just put out a critical minerals report. You know, tell us a little bit about what the government's doing in terms of taking action to shore up the resiliency of the supply chain and provide more into the supply chain and work with the OEM manufacturers to do more of that value-added manufacturing in Australia.
No worries, Todd. Look, as you know, there's a lot of minerals in Australia. We're number 1 in the world for production of lithium. We're number 2 in the world for manganese, and number 2, sometimes, well, it depends on production or if we're looking at actually how much there is there for rare earths, pretty high for cobalt and nickel as well, and the list goes on. There's plenty of opportunities for investment. Austrade's critical minerals prospectus outlines about 150 projects at various stages of readiness. So there's a lot. And you can look at some of the investment that's happening in Australia right now. Lithium in Australia investment is skyrocketing. There was about $500 million worth of invested just in the last quarter. And there's plenty of support mechanisms too for investors. Firstly, we have the Major Projects Facilitation Office that helps investors get through regulatory approval processes. We have Export Finance Australia, which is helping to support mining companies through loan facilities. And in terms of downstream processing, as you mentioned, Todd, in May, CSIRO launched the Critical Energy Minerals Roadmap, and that roadmap, seeks to sort of connect our strength in critical minerals mining to opportunities further down in the processing and manufacturing. And as I mentioned, the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. But there's a few other things that are out there, such as the biggest support for R&D in Australia is our R&D tax incentive program. And that's a long-established program that provides tax offsets for eligible R&D activities. And mining companies have been using that and can use that to improve their refining and processing operations. And then probably finally too, I'd probably get killed if I didn't mention the Global Visa Talent Program, which is a streamlined visa pathway for highly skilled professionals to work and live permanently in Australia. So there's a lot of things in Australia, but we aren't just takers of investment. Australian companies are investing in the US in mining exploration. And there are at least 20 projects that I know of in the US that involve Australian mining companies. Rio is one of them. I was going to mention tellurium. Jervois developing a cobalt mine in Idaho. Syria's got its spherical graphite in Louisiana. Linus, as we mentioned, in Texas, and doing lithium is Controlled Thermal Resources. So that's just to name a few. So there's lots of things happening, both to support companies in Australia, but also wanted to make a point that we're also investing in the US.
That's great. And I think on the added value supply chain in Australia, I mean, obviously I have a lot of experience in the aluminum sector, and it's always something I try and remind people of. Australia already has a very robust mine to metal supply chain in production of aluminum. The bauxite processed right in the same country into aluminum, first into alumina and then into aluminum. So you definitely know you can do it. It's great to hear that there's other sectors like lithium and nickel where the processing will also occur in Australia. Any questions for Anne before we sort of leave Australia from the rest of the panel? Okay, Anna, I was going to ask you, we talked a little bit about the power of procurement to basically help create demand. And obviously governments like Australia, governments like the US can do a lot through their own procurement. You and I have spent a lot of time on policies that prioritize buying products that have low carbon footprints. So this basically the movement of buy clean. Is there more that governments can do around these differential factors and basically talking to the people, the companies that are providing them with defense systems and other major programs to say, you know what, we don't want to see the lithium for this battery to be produced outside of, a group of allies, or, we want to make sure that the cobalt that goes into this is verified of a certain standard. Is procurement one area that for those of us that are really want to focus on this, is this an area that we need to advocate more and provide either higher standards or more ways to verify some of these things?
It's a great question, Todd. I think procurement is absolutely an important tool that government has to look at, and that the private sector has to look to. The idea of utilizing public procurement and doing some of the things that we've talked about related to, buying products with lower embodied carbon, or buying products that, ensuring that products aren't made with forced labor or child labor. This is countering the narrative that cheapest is best. And I think that's really one of the big challenges that we have here. And that's really the kind of exciting thing about the conversation here in Washington right now is I think there's growing recognition that we need both the supply side. We need to get more mines up and running. We need to figure out more processing here. We need to, that whole supply chain up, to manufacturing components, to final assembly of these technologies. But we also need that demand side, and the government has an ability to do that and to help drive the market, and the private sector has to step up too. The private sector has to make decisions to not buy things just because they're cheap, but buy things that are made in ways that are responsible to the planet, responsible to working people, and that just are generally going to be good for our economy and our national security. So I think because this is so much a part of the conversation, we're really optimistic, but we recognize there is a lot of work to do there, a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I like your point about the private sector actually having to take these things on as well. I mean, Bill Gates has been very clear about that, and sort of the breakthrough energy focus on procurement, that the private sector's got an obligation to use their procurement. But it's actually, if you're a procurement officer at an OEM and you weren't able to get chips, it's also risk management, because your entire production has been jeopardized by just-in-time delivery that failed. And so it's really a risk thing, as well as what's right for the planet, what's right for the workforce. So I think that's going to be a very healthy discussion about what factors are important beyond price and quality, and a rise in that. So procurement officers' jobs just got a lot more complex. Frank, Tarak, any comments on that?
Yeah, I guess I mean that's a really good point. I mean you're exactly right. I mean if you've got 70% of your supply of anything coming through one place, that's a choke point. You know, it's a choke point. And if you're anticipating the demand for the thing that you produce is going to grow 500%, and you're trying to put 500% more inputs through the same choke point, then just for your ability to deliver for your customer, you're incented to create an alternative supply chain. And I guess, you know, we kind of understand the exponential growth and demand for these things. By accelerating climate-related targets and clean energy targets, we're moving up that supply shortfall. So, you know, I guess be provocative to ask Turok, how do we have a corresponding accelerant for the supply? Because you're not going to realize your ambition unless we kind of figure this out. And I guess part of that, I was thinking about and reflecting on some of Anne's comments about some of the programs that are already ongoing. And you know, some of the constrained minerals we have as identified in the report are like nickel and cobalt, right, for electric vehicles. And you know, there's a project in Australia, Sunrise Energy Metals. It's cobalt-rich nickel project, which also has scandium, which is like cool for all kinds of defense applications. And there are programs that we have with most of these are defense related, but we can kind of catalyze the procurement through those kind of channels. And I guess that's just one mechanism to accelerate that, but we have to move this forward. We can't, I mean, that's great that we have a 10-year whole of government report, but we're going to be on the other end of the climate targets if we can't wait, is my point. So how do we do that? And how do we mobilize this private sector to be that force to make that happen with government, as Anne alluded. Thank you.
Well, that's exactly right. We can't wait. And so that's why with the release of the supply chain report earlier this week, we identified 20 executive actions that we're taking right away, including many on the supply side. And you know, the rest we've just got to work with Congress and really tell the story that you're telling, Frank, and the one that you're telling, Anna, about the urgency of the crisis, the climate crisis, and how we've got to work, how critical minerals are, you know, particularly tied into that.
Turok, do you want to say a little bit as well about how the department is looking at the 7 national labs and CMI as a place to drive this innovation and collaboration with the workforce and with the private sector? Absolutely.
Well, thanks for giving a shout out to our national labs and to our DOE programs. They are amazing places to work and generate incredible research, development, and products. So here at DOE, we've developed a sort of a 3-pronged strategy to guide our work on critical materials. One is what we were just talking about, diversifying our supply chains. 2, to develop substitutes, and 3, to improve reuse and recycling. On the first, we've got a wide range of options for boosting our domestic supply chain. Of course, that includes increasing our efforts to mine materials here in the US. But we can also work to extract critical minerals from secondary sources like waste left at coal mines or from coal ash from power plant sites. You know, already there are a bunch of companies producing commercial grade lithium from tailings at old mine sites, and in the process cleaning up those sites and restoring the environment while creating jobs all at once. We've got a really exciting approach to pulling lithium out of geothermal brines at our nation's largest geothermal power plant near the Salton Sea in California. The DOE is helping to fund. We can invest in more of these really creative approaches. You know, so other approaches are around recovering critical minerals, including rare earths from streams impacted by acid mine drainage, and in the process scaling up and identifying opportunities to use these technologies in coal communities that are in transition. You know, just last week, I saw an amazing example of this while I was in West Virginia with Secretary Granholm and Senator Joe Manchin, and with the leadership of our U.S. Mine Workers Union. And that project is a win-win because it can recover resources in coal communities, it can create jobs, and it can address environmental concerns that are very real in those communities. On the second prong on substitutes, you mentioned CMI, that's the U.S. Department of Energy Critical Materials Institute, and they're looking for substitutes for rare earths and critical materials. One, over the years, we've done a lot of work already to reduce the need for platinum group metals, especially with nickel-based catalysis, and now we're working really hard to replace cobalt in battery chemistries. And on recycling, this is an area where we really expect to grow in the coming years, especially as we see an increasing number of EVs and stationary storage batteries come to the end of their first life. And as we proposed in the supply chain report, it's time for the US to establish a national recovery and recycling policy with incentives and to ensure it's done with the highest environmental standards in mind before these huge volumes of batteries come to the end of their first life. The planet really just cannot afford for us to simply throw out batteries and critical minerals anymore. And so really excited about a number of different approaches among all of the prongs of our strategy here at DOE.
Yeah, can I ask you one question to follow up on if you're in the mining sector and you're trying to develop a nickel mine or a cobalt mine, you start to hear things like replacement, and it maybe scares you and your investors. And from all my conversations with people at CMI, it's not about trying to change the market tomorrow. It's about the natural evolution of technology to improve the technology. And the labs are there to do basic science and to find ways of the next generation of change. It's not to, bust the market for a particular input, tomorrow. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think all you have to do is look at the scale of the need, and the reason we're looking for alternatives is because we're going to need so much of all of these. So it's not necessarily about, the market opportunity here is huge. And this is about making sure we aren't facing supply chain crunches like the ones we're experiencing right now in timber and semiconductors and the ones we experienced over the course of this pandemic.
Good. Well, conscious of time, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to just say a few words of closing. And if I could just add for one steer here, in your closing remarks, if the panel could just sort of focus on what are the things that the US and Australia can do together as allies in this area, and what are the one or two ideas that deserve the most focus and attention and resource? Frank, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thank you. Well, firstly, as mentioned earlier, the U.S. and Australia have such a strong foundation in so many areas, of course, but also long histories of responsible resource development. And I think by continuing to advance what best practice looks like and project that globally, U.S., Australia had led some critical minerals and energy bilateral dialogues. Of course, Australia is a founding member of the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, but we can take that on the road, as it were. And the European Union is looking to integrate human rights, for example, in their own domestic, indigenous battery supply chain concept. Green Deal funding should integrate these. How do we? So my thought is, how do we build on these foundations and kind of have this network of standard setting, and then also project that and support countries that may like to get U.S. and Australian investment. How do we help those countries improve their own standard on the ground, and also make it attractive for U.S. or Australian companies to invest in those third countries? Because only then will we really be able to have that new standard setting be achieved and provide that economic opportunity, get the resources that we all need together. And then just, I mentioned briefly, but back to the supercharge the kind of, and Ann spoke eloquently to some of the defense partnerships already existing. I think it provides an easy way to kind of get real dollars flowing, get real supplies moving, which will trigger broader private sector finance. Thanks.
Great. Anne?
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, look, it's interesting, but US is Australia's biggest research partner. And interestingly, materials engineering is our second biggest area of joint collaboration between our universities and science and technology institutes. So we are collaborating on the research front, and our researchers, like the US, are world-class in this area. So I think there's opportunities to collaborate further on research and commercialization and doing demonstration projects as well. The second thing I think Frank mentioned on standards, I think that's really important to keep collaborating on that side. And third is on the policy side, I think there's an opportunity for both countries to learn a little bit about how others do their mining approval processes. We have our different states, have different processes, and it's quicker in some than others. But overall in Australia, it doesn't take that long. It takes about 5 years to get permitting up, which is pretty good. And whilst we don't have the population density that the US does, we still have native title rights for our Indigenous peoples. So I think we could share learnings about those sorts of things in terms of a policy, in terms of a policy discussion. Thank you.
That's a really important point. Anna?
So I'll just actually build on both what Frank and Anne said. I think that the real opportunity here is around building on this responsible development of supply chains and standards, but to put a bit more of a finer point on it, or add something, I'll say, I think there are really three things that need to happen. One is this needs to be proactive. I think we've seen what being reactionary, the damage that being reactionary has caused. The second piece is really working to engage a broad set of stakeholders, including unions. We talk a fair bit with our brothers and sisters in unions in Australia, and I'm sure that they would be eager to be at the table as well, because we talk about these same issues. And then the last thing is really have make sure that we're taking a view of the whole supply chain. Actions and activities may focus down in on a particular mineral or particular material, but we need to understand how that interplays with the rest of the supply chain. Yeah.
Great, awesome. Tarak.
Great. Well, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on this panel today. Being Australia adjacent is helping me picture myself on Bondi Beach, and that's a nice feeling. Frank and Anna all had really good words. All mentioned robust global standard processes, and let's do that together, and let's do that on the high road, and let's do it quickly, particularly as this market develops so rapidly over the coming months and years. There's really no doubt, stepping back, that the US is playing catch up here. But if we go big and go big right now, we can make up for lost ground in this country. President Biden's proposed an American Jobs Plan to do just that. And so for the companies and stakeholders who are listening in today, if you like what you see in that plan, then I encourage you to speak up. The consequences of not doing so, of not developing end-to-end industrial strategies for a whole variety of industries, critical materials included, they're huge. And our competitiveness is at stake, our security is at stake, the planet is at stake. And other governments, China, Europe, they've developed these strategies and are implementing them. In the US, the president has stood up to say we can't stand idly by and watch them do that. So we've got to act now to lead the future. And over the next 4 and 8 years, that's exactly what you're going to see us do. Thanks, Todd.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. I know how busy you are, so really appreciate you taking time to join us. We're basically out of time. I just to wrap up, my concluding comments are that I think everybody is focused on as we emerge out of COVID, leveraging the crisis that we've been through and the experience that we've been through to attack some of these problems, to leverage the innovation that we have in Australia and in the United States, and to take on these problems, take on the massive challenge of climate change and decarbonizing our industrial operations, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and subtracting carbon from the atmosphere. These are all things that are going to require more metals and minerals and expert manufacturing and innovation. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity. And I think Australia and the United States are incredibly well positioned. And on behalf of the board of the American Australian Association, I'm really grateful for Ambassador Sinodinos to join us today and kick us off, and for your time for joining us, all of the panel. I can promise you that this will not be the last time we do one of these. So hopefully we'll have another one in maybe a year's time when we can celebrate some new markers of success between the US and Australia in this area. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us.